Okay, great. So the recess is ending and the meeting will come to order at 7:06 p.m. With that said, I'm going to give the floor to staff to make their presentation.
All right, good evening once again, commissioners, and thank you for your patience. My name is Jason Gelder. I'm the city engineer, and with me this evening is Jennifer Hrodsky, associate engineer. Also joining us is Katie Cole from Fair and Peers and our slide master, and Eric Rohr from VRPA Technologies. Both Ms. Cole and Mr. Rohr have been instrumental in developing VMT policies in the San Diego region. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background on the policies that are leading up to tonight's presentation. California Senate Bill 743 was passed in late 2013, and that changed the way transportation impacts are evaluated in CEQA. The bill required an alternative metric to measure transportation impacts that would promote reduction of greenhouse gases, development of multimodal transportation networks, and a diversity of land uses. The bill is in response to state emission targets established in various bills and executive orders by the governor. Next slide. The Senate bill stated that level of service shall not be used to measure transportation impacts in CEQA. Although the bill did not specify a particular metric to use for transportation impacts, it did suggest VMT as a potential metric among a few others. Additionally, the bill directed the Office of Planning and Research to develop revisions to CEQA guidelines. The revision would include recommendations for evaluating transportation impacts. Next slide, please. So the OPR, Office of Planning and Research, or OPR, developed an advisory document that makes recommendations for implementing Senate Bill 743, along with presenting substantial evidence supporting their recommendations. The advisory became available in December 2018, so that'd be 5 years after the bill was passed. This advisory document is a resource for lead agencies to use at their discretion. Lead agencies may consider alternative thresholds of significance provided that they are supported by substantial evidence. City of Carlsbad has generally followed OPR's recommendations. OPR does say that the bill preserves local government authority to make planning decisions. So this is important. This means that LOS and congestion can still be measured for planning purposes. Projects in the city of Carlsbad will continue to be required to use transportation impact analysis guidelines to evaluate level of service for vehicle, pedestrians, bicycles, and transit to ensure they comply with growth management requirements and general plan policies. However, any deficiencies identified through this analysis are not considered CEQA impacts. So I'd like to introduce Ms. Cole from Fair and Peers again, and she will now discuss VMT and how it's calculated.
Thank you, Jason. Good evening to everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about what VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, are, and how it relates back to the recommendations that OPR made and the recommendations that are in the Carlsbad guidelines. So VMT is the amount and distance of auto travel. I like to think of it as my odometer. It's all of the miles that I rack up in my car throughout the day, and it can be evaluated or viewed in different ways depending on the purpose of the analysis. So for example, in some cases, it might be helpful to look at VMT on a per person basis. So if you have a particular planning area that you're looking at and you want to understand how much VMT is being generated per person, you would add up the VMT of all of the people as part of that planning area and then divide it by the total number of people in that area. That's sometimes called an efficiency metric. And for purposes of complying with SB 743 and what OPR recommended, they suggested that we look at efficiency metrics for both residential land use types on a VMT per resident or per capita basis, and a VMT per employee metric as it pertains to employment-based uses, so things like offices. The other way that that VMT is evaluated for purposes of SB 743 is a change in VMT in an area or on a roadway network. So as an example, a grocery store or a retail project, when you add additional retail or service to a location that doesn't already have that service, you can actually affect VMT by reducing it, because now all of a sudden somebody who maybe used to have to drive 10 miles to get to a grocery store has an option of only driving 5. And so as it pertains to retail uses, and in particular regional retail uses, OPR suggests evaluating the change in total area or roadway VMT. So to give you a little bit of technical details about how it's calculated for purposes of SB 743, and this slide is specifically related to those efficiency metrics, so VMT per resident or VMT per employee. We actually have created some, we'll call them kind of analysis maps that show how much VMT particular areas within the city generate. And for a project that generates less than 2,400 average daily trips, or ADT, the project would take a look at those analysis maps to determine what their VMT is. Any project that generates more than 2,400 ADT, or average daily traffic, would run the SANDAG travel demand model. In addition, if there was a regional retail project that required us to evaluate a change in VMT, that would also require the use of the SANDAG travel demand model. So the next couple of slides just give you an example of how those VMT analysis maps work. So this is for projects that are under 2,400 ADT. So a project VMT per person or per resident is assumed to be the same as the VMT that is calculated for its traffic analysis zone. A traffic analysis zone is a geographic unit that is used within the travel demand model. It's a collection of land uses, and typically the boundaries are roadways, but it's a pretty consistent geography that SANDAG uses to kind of divide up the region into these smaller zones for analysis purposes. So if we kind of zoom in to a specific TAZ or traffic analysis zone, and if it was a small project, we have these reported values. So 20.27 VMT per capita and 23.28 VMT per employee. That's specific to this individual traffic analysis zone. So if we had a project that was, for example, a residential project that was under 2,400 ADT and located in this traffic analysis zone, the VMT per capita would be used to determine, to do the impact analysis for CEQA would be 20.27. If that project generated more than 2,400 daily trips, we would use the SANDAG travel demand model to determine what the project's VMT is. So with that gives you a basic overview of VMT and how it's calculated for SB 743 purposes. I'm now going to turn this over to Jennifer to talk about some other details of the guidelines.
Actually, it's Jason. I'm back. I'll go ahead and talk about the next few items. Thresholds and screening criteria. So CEQA guidelines have criteria for establishing thresholds of significance, including screening criteria. Thresholds of significance is a point where the impact becomes significant. It's the tipping point. Significance means an adverse change. So it's the tipping point between when an impact is okay and then when it becomes adverse. And screening criteria is a presumption of no significant impact based on certain project characteristics. And in case of VMT, one of the characters may be that it's near really good transit. So a project being near really good transit would just be screened out of having a significant impact on VMT. So our Carlsbad VMT analysis guidelines, Carlsbad guidelines largely follow the OPR guidelines and include but they also include additional details and methodologies and mitigation measures. As part of developing the guidelines, staff evaluated OPR's technical advisory released in December 2018 and the regional guidelines released in May 2019. Additionally, staff evaluated other jurisdictions, although very few had published documents. Although very few of them had published documents, so there wasn't a whole lot of things to review from other jurisdictions, especially in our region. And speaking of our region, Carlsbad is one of the first smaller cities to bring forward formal VMT thresholds. So I'd like to introduce Ms. Hrodsky again, and she's going to talk more specifically about what we're here for as the thresholds and screening criteria for your consideration.
Thank you, Jason. Good evening, commissioners, and thank you for your time this evening. We have 5 thresholds of significance that are being proposed for evaluating transportation impacts. For residential projects, OPR recommends comparing a project's VMT per capita to 15% below the regional or the city average. The recommended threshold of significance for residential projects is if the project VMT per capita exceeds the level 15% below the city average. For office projects, OPR recommends comparing a project's VMT per employee to 15% below the regional average. Based on the size of the San Diego region and the VMT characteristics of the city of Carlsbad, comparison to the regional average would result in a jobs housing imbalance, and because employment in the city would be discouraged. Therefore, using a comparison to 15% below the city average is consistent with one of the primary goals of SB 743, which is promoting a diversity of land uses. And according to OPR's technical advisory for residential and office projects, achieving 15% lower per capita or per employee VMT is both achievable and is consistent with meeting the state's emissions goals. For industrial projects, OPR recommends comparing a project's VMT per employee to an average. There are no recommendations for an OPR for industrial uses. Other agencies have proposed using VMT per employee and comparing it to an average. OPR states that residential, office, and retail uses have the greatest influence on VMT, and industrial uses tend to be land intensive. Therefore, locating them in the less VMT efficient areas allows the more VMT efficient areas to be used more effectively. OPR recommends that retail uses be compared for a net increase in total VMT. That would be considered a significant impact. This is based on the fact that retail tends to redistribute existing trips rather than creating new trips. Therefore, this is the most appropriate metric. For transportation projects, a net increase in total VMT can be considered a significant impact. And this is based on the regional guidelines for transportation impact studies in the city of San Diego. OPR does not provide any specific recommendations on this, but it does give some criteria that should be considered when selecting a significance threshold. And this is met by the regional guidelines recommendation that a significant impact would be considered a net increase in total VMT. Next slide. So there's 7 screening criteria that are currently being proposed. For small projects, less than 100, a project that generates less than 110 ADT can be screened out from needing to complete a detailed analysis. And this is based on a CEQA categorical exemption where CEQA allows a project up to 10,000 square feet to be exempt, presumed to be less than significant. And then an ADT estimate is calculated based on that size building. Certain project types within half mile of transit can be presumed to be less than significant. There's 2 types of transit facilities that would qualify for this screening criteria. One is a major transit stop, and one is a high quality transit corridor. So both of those, if a residential, office, or retail project is within half mile of that, they can be presumed to be less than significant. OPR recommends that locally serving retail uses be considered to have less than a significant impact, and that's based on the fact that Typically, locally serving retail uses tend to redistribute trips and make them shorter because, as Katie mentioned, it becomes closer to get to the grocery store as opposed to needing to drive to one that's further away. Next slide. If a project is comprised of entirely affordable housing, it can be presumed to be less than significant and screened out. Affordable housing tends to improve the jobs housing match. Therefore, it tends to reduce VMT. So if a project is a redevelopment project, if it's replacing an existing use, you can essentially look at how the existing use and the proposed use compare. And if there's a net decrease in total VMT for the site, not the roadway network, but just the site, then OPR recommends that that project could be presumed to have a less than significant impact. Locally serving public facilities are not discussed in OPR's technical advisory, but other agencies have proposed allowing them to be screened out of a detailed VMT analysis because they act a little bit like retail, where if a public, like a park or a school, is constructed, then it might actually shorten trips because people aren't driving to one that's further now. And then OPR's technical advisory includes a list of criteria that could be screened out for transportation projects, and that includes things like bicycle projects, pedestrian projects, transit projects, and maintenance projects. But there's a whole slew of them. It's pretty diverse, and that's contained in an OPR's technical advisory. Next slide. In conclusion, a resolution will be prepared basically containing all of the screening criteria and the threshold of significance that I just went over in the last 3 slides. And that will be provided to City Council for approval. And the VMT analysis guidelines that were included in your agenda packet were included for reference, but will not be moving forward for approval. Therefore, staff recommends that the Traffic and Mobility Commission recommend to the City Council adoption of a resolution approving citywide vehicle miles traveled thresholds and screening criteria pursuant to Senate Bill 743. Next slide. Oh, that's it. Thank you for your time, and now we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Okay, let's see. Do we still have energy for more questions? We're going to go on the list. Commissioner Hunter.
I'll pass my time to Commissioner Linke and reserve to be able to ask questions later.
Okay, so maybe I should have changed the order, have Commissioner Linke go first. And then, okay, I'm going to make Commissioner Linke second.
Means I'm up.
Your time is up. I mean,
Okay.
on.
I'm up. Yeah, this is a huge topic and not much time to review it. So I'm going to start with a really difficult question. If you look at Carlsbad and its current state of build out, what proportion of projects do we think that are remaining to be done here would be even subject to these guidelines? Is that too broad a question?
Thank you for the
No,
question.
it's not.
Thank you for the question, Steve. Jason, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can start to address that. We currently have 2 projects and maybe 3 projects that are because of the July 1st deadline that they know that they're going to have to evaluate VMT. So we do have projects right now looking at evaluating VMT. We do have quite a few projects that probably will not screen out, and we'll have to address VMT in one way or another. We have housing projects and some commercial projects.
Okay.
I don't have exact numbers for you, but there's quite a few projects still coming into the city.
Okay. I just wasn't sure, given the thresholds and exemptions, whether how much we would be doing. Could we go back to the slide on the traffic analysis zones? So I'm just going to ask a few more questions, and it's all sort of hypotheticals just to help educate me and maybe the rest of the commission. So the light blue region there, which is I think predominantly the Village and Barrio area, that's defined as 85%. The residents there, those zones, 85% below, or sorry, the city average That's 85% or less of the city average for the per capita travel there. Is that correct?
Commissioner Linke, thank you for the question. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so then the question is, hypothetically, if you have that as being below, by definition, all those areas are below a threshold, does that mean that anybody can build a residential project there up to generation of 2,400 new trips per day and not be subject to the guidelines? And before you answer, you can see if my calculations are correct. Based on the SANDAG guidance, 2,400 trips per day would include a 240 house development, or a 400 apartment building, or 600 retirement community units. Would all those, which are seen to me as pretty large projects, would all those be not subject to VMT analysis based on their location in those zones, those blue zones?
If a project is in the blue zone, then it would essentially conduct a VMT analysis consistent with what we have been talking about with regards to using the VMT numbers from that TAZ. But what they will find is that the number is less than 15%, it's more than 50% less than the city average, therefore they don't have an impact. So they would still be using the map, but the map would tell them that that they are presumed to have a less than significant impact. And this is consistent with what OPR talks about in its technical advisory. It states that if a project is located in an area that is VMT efficient, then essentially you can assume that a project that is put in that area will exhibit similar VMT characteristics. So the city, with these maps, the city's essentially done the analysis to show the areas that that we know work well. And so a project that, if it's one of the smaller projects, has the ability to take advantage of these assumptions that that OPR has discussed in its technical advisory.
Okay, it's just a concern, I guess, to me, and I understand you're just following the state guidance, but it's a concern to me that you could build a 600-unit apartment complex in any of those blue regions and be able to say we're not generating any vehicle miles out of those 600 units. Okay, next.
Commissioner Linke, can I think I'd like to make a distinction and then have Katie or Ms. Cole comment on that, because that's a good point you're trying to make, or a question you're asking. And a lot of people have asked that. And it's true that when you build a project in those areas, you are going to add miles. Any new project would add VMT. However, the metric that we're using is an efficiency metric. And what that is, it's a VMT per person. So it's not the total VMT, it's what each person is going to contribute on an average. And I'd like to, Katie, just to comment on how projects really don't affect and we had this discussion a little bit earlier, how even bigger projects don't really change the model on the efficiencies of VMT. Is that correct, Katie?
Sure, I can add to that a bit. So yeah, the key here is that what we're looking at is an efficiency metric. And so what we know about the travel demand model is that if a project is existing today and it's an efficient project, maybe it only generates 15 VMT per person. If an apartment, say that's for an apartment complex, the people of that apartment complex on average generate 15 VMT per person. If you put a project that is an apartment complex nearby, the expectation and what the model will show you is that it also is going to have an efficiency that's similar to its neighbors. So 15 VMT per person. It's not that on a net basis that that new complex isn't generating VMT. It's looking at those residents and how similar in their travel characteristics are they to their existing neighbors. And then the other small clarification I'll make here is that projects under 2,400 ADT from a regional travel demand model perspective are just, if you're thinking of the scale of a regional travel demand model, are a relatively small project. And therefore, a regional travel demand model is not going to be as sensitive to those smaller types of projects, which is why it is consistent with how SANDAG has historically performed modeling, to really look at only running, kind of doing new model runs if your project is a larger project, so over that 2,400 ADT number.
Okay, but I guess what it boils down to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because this is not an area I have a lot of expertise in, is that the VMT is all about what we're compelling the developer to do to help fix the problem. So if you build a 600 unit apartment complex in the village area, and it's by definition, because it's located there, it's not subject to VMT, then you can't compel the developer to, for example, contribute funds for transit or to take whatever other measures might encourage those people that are living in that 600 unit apartment complex to not drive their cars. So what we're looking at here is what's the threshold to compel a developer to contribute to TDM or whatever. Is that an accurate reflection?
Yes. Do you want me to answer, Jason?
I was just going to say that that's part of what the state is trying to do with this bill is exactly what you said, is put these units in the village and get these clusters together in VMT efficient areas, and that's enough to mitigate. So to the state, that's the whole goal, is to make these VMT efficient areas. In Carlsbad, however, there's potentially other triggers for TDM and things like that. But yes, you're right. If you're in a VMT efficient area, there wouldn't, through CEQA, there wouldn't be any mitigation or anything like that. That would have to be a local planning rule or something that maybe.
Right, and our TDM ordinance does not cover residential development, so that wouldn't cover that either, which is why we need to, and you answered my question that I submitted in writing, was, are we retaining the level of service? Because we've got pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and vehicle level of service, which can maybe help us fund. I'll just give one other hypothetical, and that is the local serving retail. So from my reading, it says that you can have an up to 50,000 square foot store that serves Carlsbad, Oceanside, Vista, San Marcos, and Encinitas, and that's approximately the size of a football field, and also not I don't want to get the wording wrong here, not be subject to VMT, or not, you're under the threshold because you are local serving. You're called local serving even though you're the size of a football field and could serve these communities around us. Or am I misreading that?
We would look at the type of retail too. So let's say it's a big box store, name your own box store on this case, and we get and one is proposed in Carlsbad, and let's say there's some others that are in the region. Essentially what would happen is people from Carlsbad, instead of traveling outside the city, or people nearby Carlsbad traveling further out to those stores, would actually travel closer, to the closer store and save VMT in a way. So that's how that's looked at, is even if it's a big store and it's not unique, then that would be a VMT saver. But if it was a one-of-a-kind, big box, one-of-a-kind store, and it's going to start drawing people from San Diego and all over the place, and it's the only one of its kind, then that would be looked at as not really locally serving retail, and we'd have to do a model run and see what mitigation measures they may have to do. And then jump on in, Katie, if you have anything else to add, or Jennifer.
I would add two clarifications. One is that 50,000 square feet is not arbitrary. It is actually referenced in the OPR technical advisory as an appropriate threshold that could be considered. Anything bigger than that may be considered regionally serving retail. And then secondly, it it might be helpful to add that the size of a small grocery store is roughly about 40 to 50,000 square feet. So, you know, typically in Katie's example, if we were to see a small grocery store go in, for example, in a place like Robertson Ranch, the undeveloped commercial parcel, you would see a lot of VMT savings from the residents in Robertson Ranch who are currently driving all the way down to Bressy Ranch or all the way up to 78 in El Camino Real. The threshold essentially comes from the OPR recommendation for the size that can be considered locally serving.
Okay, last question is related to that. I'm kind of sensitive to Carlsbad specific rules. Are there anything that has been customized in this that's specifically for Carlsbad, or is this seems to be predominantly based on the OPR guidance and maybe some San Diego City stuff, but is there anything that's unique to Carlsbad because that would raise a red flag for me?
That's a great question, Commissioner Linke, thank you. There's a couple of Carlsbad specific thresholds and screening criteria that have been proposed. One is the threshold for office projects, which is a little different. We can maybe go to that slide. OPR recommends comparing to the regional average, but we have selected to recommend to compare to the city average, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I can go over that again if you'd like. And then for the screening criteria, there's a couple that we added. The locally serving public facilities, I actually believe that might be the only one. We're not on that slide right now. But that one's based on San Diego. Oh, and the industrial one that's right in front of me is also based on the city of San Diego. So those are unique to Carlsbad. They're based on discussions that we've had looking at other the regional guidelines, at other guidelines that have been proposed by other cities, and then we essentially in our guidelines provide as in the appendix some substantial evidence for each of, especially for these thresholds that that are Carlsbad specific. So that will be included in the VMT guidelines.
Okay, and I lied. I have one final question. Are we going to somehow try to harmonize the VMT CEQA rules and the level of service growth management program rules and the TDM program? I think we should explore like really just harmonizing all that so it's clear. Otherwise it gets confusing probably for developers and for residents about how all that's supposed to work.
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Commissioner. I'll answer and then I'll turn it over to Jason in case he wants to add anything. But we will continue to require both analyses, one for CEQA and one for our local traffic impact analysis guidelines, so that we're looking both at the environmental impact and also we're looking at the local, kind of like the local mobility impact. So that'll all be in one document. With regards to the TDM plans, the proposal is to essentially combine the TDM measures that are coming out of CEQA and our TDM ordinance and any mobility element TDM plans into one plan, so that it all gets monitored essentially under one survey and one transportation coordinator, and we can sort of track the TDM measures under one specific plan. But I'll let Jason add anything he might want to for how we're treating those three things.
Yeah, you're correct. It has confused some developers because they are so different, because VMT is so different from LOS, and they are two different animals that need to be addressed. So we will, Jennifer answered that very well, that we will be combining our documents, and you will be seeing probably the TIA guidelines here in the future. But they are really different. So developers will be evaluating level of service per GMP and general plan policies, and they'll also be evaluating VMT per CEQA.
Ranch specifically, I know that corner ECR and Cannon. Once that retail becomes available, if it does develop, it looks like it is. So just so that I'm clear on this, would it be, so that would affect the VMT, sorry. And then also with that, so like you said, to go northbound to get to the nearest retail, that would be like around 3 miles. And then to go southbound to Bressie Ranch, that would be like around 4 miles. Once that's established, would that affect like a half-mile radius around the area? So what I'm getting at is on that picture or that of the map of the zones, would you see a change in the color scheme or whatever you want to call that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think obviously the distance that it's going to influence is going to be really impacted by, you know, what's closer for people, because you have different distances in different directions where you would have the nearest grocery store. But I think I'll let Eric maybe answer this question if we haven't seen Eric yet, right?
Good evening, commissioners. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, for the analysis of this specific project that we're talking about, commercial at Robertson Ranch, the assumption would just be that particular development would decrease VMT. And I think that you're getting at the idea that would change travel patterns slightly, you know, over the city as people rearrange where their origins and destinations are. And while we wouldn't go back and redo the model or look at citywide VMT just on the basis of that project, probably something like every 4 years we would do a new regional model, calculate new VMT per employee and VMT per capita numbers. And so on the basis of every 4 years or so, then we would capture the changes that would occur through small developments on a cumulative basis.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Pensier, do you have any questions?
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate when Commissioner Linke goes through his review of these things and comes up with all these great questions. And from my review of a very superficial review of this, I noticed that the one area of the city that is currently undeveloped is around the Sage Creek High School, in fact, the area of the college extension. And if that's developed with residential, that would be, I think that's one of the ones that's over the city average. So how would that then impact the developer if he tries to put in residences that exceed the average or 15% below the city average there? Is that going to limit their ability to build there, or do they have to wait until there's enough commercial development in the area or jobs in the area that it brings the whole average down again? Does anybody understand the question?
Yeah,
Great question.
I think that's another good question, and I think I know what you're getting at. So I'll take the first part is when a project, when they analyze the VMT and they are above the threshold, there are mitigation measures that could be put in place to mitigate that impact, and those are basically transportation demand management measures that would be put in place. And for example, would be bus passes or transportation passes if there's anything nearby, or ride sharing or things like that could be incorporated into the project. In the worst case, a project may not be able to mitigate all its impact, and they would then develop an EIR and just report an overriding consideration, and it would just be up to the decision maker at that point whether to accept the project. So it would be up to council to say, okay, it's a housing project, and that puts us in a conundrum there because we want more housing, but yet there could be this impact. So that would be something the decision makers would decide on, is to accept those impacts to allow the housing.
Do you have any more questions, Commissioner Pensier?
Yeah, I think that answered the question. I gather from that answer that I wouldn't expect to see much change, that we're just going to do the same thing we always have and just cover it with paper.
Okay, we're going to move on to Commissioner Fowler.
Yeah, I may have missed this reading through and listening, but where does the VMT come from? Does Carlsbad calculate its own VMT?
I'm going to let Katie talk about the VMT comes from a regional model, and I'll let Katie give a little.
Oh, okay, that's sufficient. Okay, well, go ahead. That's my main question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's anything beyond just that. SANDAG maintains a regional travel demand model. And just like today, if a developer is needing to do some forecasting that requires use of a travel demand model, SANDAG would typically perform that analysis. So the SANDAG travel demand model was used to establish the analysis maps that you saw as part of your package, and also would be used to perform analysis if a project generated more than 2,400 ADT.
Thanks. That's all.
Okay, Vice Chair Johnson. You are on mute. Okay. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay. And I don't have any questions either. I think Commissioner Linky and the other commissioners covered most of my questions. Are we ready to go for a vote? To make a motion?
Can I ask a clarification on the vote, or on the recommendation? We're just voting probably to recommend the screening and thresholds, right? Not the mitigation or how the mitigation would be, the effectiveness would be tracked, because that's kind of not
Can
here.
staff put up on the slide the recommendation on the vote, please?
Yes, Commissioner Linky, that's correct. It's a recommendation essentially to approve the 5 thresholds of significance and the 7 screening criteria, and then the guidance on mitigation measures and how to evaluate VMT will be contained in the VMT analysis guidelines.
And will that be brought back to us in the future, that part?
That's going to be a bit of a living document. There's a lot of evolving information that's happening in this field right now because it's relatively new. So we'll basically look at, keep an eye on the regional guidelines, on OPR's technical advisories, and the emerging guidance on mitigation, and update that as needed based on our discussions with our consultants.
All right, since it's just the screening and threshold criteria, which seem mostly consistent with state guidance and City of San Diego, I would move to support staff's recommendation.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, please note that Commissioner Linky made the motion to move staff recommendation that the Traffic and Mobility Commission recommend to the City Council adoption of a resolution approving city-wide vehicle miles traveled thresholds and screening criteria pursuant to Senate Bill 743. Commissioner Hunter seconded. Can we please go to a vote?
Yes. Commissioner Perez?
Yay.
Commissioner Linky?
Yes.
Commissioner Fowler?
Yes.
Commissioner Pensiers?
Yes.
Commissioner Hunter?
Yes.
Vice Chair Johnson? Yes. Chair Goken?
Yes. Please note that it passed unanimously. On a side note, I can't wait to go back to our usual in-person meeting, because every meeting we're beating a new record. We're almost finishing the 5th hour, okay? I know everybody's comfortable at home, but It's not that comfortable. Okay.